Imagine this. You arrived in America a year ago, settling near Augusta, Georgia, with the intention to start a plantation. Like many other colonists around you, you viewed the crown sympathetically. You associated the crown with home, with hearth, your family, and the Protestant cause. You knew there were problems with rebels, but you figured it would be dealt with in good time. At any rate, it seemed very unlikely that violence would come to sleepy Augusta anytime soon. It's August 1775, a hot summer day. You hear a knocking at the door. Upon answering, you are accosted by a gang of 130 armed men, who accuse you of insufficient loyalty to the cause of independence. You communicate that you want only peace, but could never enter into an engagement to take up arms against the country which gave you being. The armed mob is unsatisfied with this answer. You change your tune and head inside to grab your weapons, at which point you are beaten over the head with a gun barrel. You pass out with a cracked skull. You don't remember what happens next, but when you wake up, you are tied to a tree, and you have hot black pitch poured over your legs. The patriots then light you on fire, badly scalding and maiming your flesh. In an act of complete savagery, your scalp and hair are chipped away from your skull with knives. It's in this state that you are transported to prison. Miraculously, you survive. An empathetic guard lets you out of prison, and you escape back to Loyalist country. Battered and bruised, barely able to walk, you manage to make it home. The violence you have experienced radicalizes you to join the ranks of the Loyalist cause. You become known for your viciousness and brutality in battle. Originally unmotivated to resist the revolution, you eventually joined the ranks of the King's Rangers. This ordeal happened to a real person. His name was Thomas Brown. A third of the residents of the American colonies were men just like Thomas Brown, who supported the Loyalist cause, and by the end of the war, 60,000 of them had left the country. What were their motivations, and where did they go? Historian Maya Janssenoff has speculated that about a third of the colonists would have been classified as Loyalists in 1776. Another third would have been patriots, leaving another third who were looking to see where their best political fortunes lay. Viewed through this lens, it might be more accurate to think of the War of Independence as a civil war, as many contemporaries described it, fought just as much between colonists as it was with outsiders like the British and French. It produced the same kind of internal divisions as the later Civil War. In the decades before the outbreak of war, various proposals had been made attempting to assuage the concerns of the colonists, shared by both later patriots and loyalists alike. The Albany Plan of Union of 1754, developed between Massachusetts Governor Hutchinson, who would later join the Loyalists, and Benjamin Franklin, proposed the creation of an American version of Parliament, loyal to the king. This plan failed during negotiations. Later, in 1774, Franklin's mentee, Joseph Galloway, the Speaker of the Pennsylvania Assembly, proposed a similar plan, which was narrowly shot down in the First Continental Congress by a 5-6 vote. Generally speaking, Loyalism was more a southern phenomenon than a northern phenomenon, although many loyalists could be found in the north as well. Loyalists were of every conceivable religion, ethnic origin, and class. As well as fresh immigrants, Loyalists came from even the earliest generations of Americans. Descendants of the Mayflower could be located in their ranks. In short, Loyalism is as American as the American Revolution itself. 20,000 slaves aligned themselves with the empire, finding that the freedom promised by the British suited them better than the liberty proposed by the Founding Fathers. And some Indian nations aligned themselves with the British as well, the Mohawks in the north and the Creeks or the Muskogee in the south. Their reasons for loyalism varied, much like any partisan conflict today. Some felt the colonies were best economically positioned by continued membership in the empire. For others, their loyalism was philosophical, religious, spiritual. For others, it was favoring the devil you know over the devil you don't. Maybe for others, it was all of the above. The lone trait that all loyalists shared was a dedication to the king. For example, Many clergymen of the Church of England found it difficult to swear off an oath, not just to their king, but to the head of their church itself. Before the events of Lexington and Concord, patriot excitement was reaching a fever pitch. Massachusetts and Virginia represented particular hotbeds of revolutionary activity, with organizations like the Sons of Liberty protesting by tarring and feathering taxmen, throwing away private property, etc. Another patriot pastime was setting up liberty poles, which they then gathered around to talk about revolutionary activities. Not everyone was quite so enthused over the idea of independence. One such man was Jacob Bailey, an Anglican priest who felt it impossible to deny his oath to the King of England. When local patriots demanded that he bless their liberty pole outside the church, a demand that he denied, his troubles began in earnest. From that time onward, he and his family were harassed, their property ransacked, and they ultimately escaped to the safe British territory of Nova Scotia. This would become a common destination for many loyalists. Many loyalists naturally enlisted for British regiments if they could find their way behind enemy lines and safely into British-occupied cities. Things were not always quite so dire. The escalations on either side are well known for American listeners: the tea tax and the subsequent Boston Tea Party, the Stamp Act, etc. But men who would later find themselves on either side of the conflict worked amicably in the years before the war to find solutions to the American crisis. Men of conscience, friends, even family would often find themselves attempting to convince each other to fight for one side or the other. Benjamin Franklin's own son, William Franklin, joined the Loyalists. He was later imprisoned. During the war, when William Franklin's wife was sick, George Washington himself refused William Franklin the right to visit her. She later died of a broken heart. The division between father and son would sadly never be healed. Stories like this played out all over revolutionary America. Loyalist Beverly Robinson was fortunate to have avoided a fate like Thomas Brown. While he did manage to avoid physical violence, he was summoned to a commission on loyalty to the king, this time being interrogated by his longtime acquaintance, John Jay. Beverly agonized over the choice to abandon his principles or to appease his friends and family. John Jay, who had once aspired for peaceful resolution with Britain, had ultimately decided to join the cause of independence. In an attempt to convince his friends to do the same, Jay reached out to Robinson's wife, Susanna, urging her to convince her husband to abandon his loyalist stance. Jay warned Beverly's wife, quote, "Remember that should you carry your numerous family to New York, famine may meet you, and incessant anxiety banish your peace. Picture to your imagination a city besieged, yourself and children mixed with contending armies. Should it be evacuated, where, and with whom, and in what manner are you next to fly? Can you think of living under the restless wings of an army? Should heaven determine that America shall be free, in what country are you prepared to spend the remainder of your days, and how provide for your children? These things, it is true, may not happen, but don't forget that they may." Despite John Jay's emotional warning, Beverly Robinson made up his mind and joined the Loyalists in March 1777. Loyalists in the North usually attempted to settle themselves in New York, occupied by the British for the majority of the war. Naturally, the lines of the conflict would often change, producing new waves of refugees heading into Loyalist territory. Loyalists in the South, desiring an environment where their plantation lifestyle could continue, sought refuge first in Savannah after its capture by the British in 1778. Savannah was valiantly defended by Loyalists but also fell. With this, the last Loyalist stronghold in the South became East Florida. And it was here where many would settle until the Treaty of Paris in 1783. When Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, Loyalists were almost in disbelief. The world had been turned upside down, the mighty British Empire brought to its knees by
an army of rabble, peasants.
Prime Minister Lord North famously uttered the lines, "Oh God, it is all over," words now echoed by many gamers. In fact, many in the North literally refused to believe that the war had been lost, assuming it was some sort of trick, until word came from official Loyalist sources. Often in histories of the Revolutionary era, historians tend to fast forward through the post-war but pre-evacuation period, a period of about 2 years. But this represented a genuine problem for the British. How could they ensure safe passage of people and property from Patriot territory? Their concerns were valid when you consider that the only requested condition of surrender rejected by Washington at Yorktown was that natives or inhabitants of different parts of this country are not to be punished on account of having joined the British Army. Washington rejected this proposal on the field. Skirmishes between Loyalist and Patriot forces did indeed continue even after Yorktown. Loyalist Americans then found themselves forced to a choice. Assuming they had been able to evacuate, not a given, many chose to simply return to England, Benjamin Franklin's son being one of them. Although many colonists had identified as British subjects for their entire lives, they saw themselves as American, and the transition to a new country, sometimes without property or connections of any kind, was often quite difficult. Americans who did opt for England did, however, sometimes have the opportunity to meet the king himself. Loyalist Samuel Shoemaker had evacuated New York in the last fleet. A Quaker, he had served as mayor of Pennsylvania before the war. One day, while attempting to spot the royal family leaving chapel, the king himself requested an audience with Shoemaker. Shoemaker was utterly charmed with the king, Queen Charlotte, and his daughters. The king would compliment the talents of the Quakers, partly in German, and remark on their contribution to the success of Pennsylvania. Shoemaker would later write in his diary, "I cannot say, but I wish some of my violent countrymen could not have such an opportunity as I have had. I think they would be convinced that George III has not one grain of tyranny in his composition, and that he cannot be that bloody-minded man they have so repeatedly and so illiberally called him. It is impossible a man of his fine feelings, so good a husband, so kind a father, cannot be a tyrant." Around 15% of the refugees decided to repatriate to England or Scotland. This was difficult for many refugees on account of the prohibitive cost of sea travel and the lack of familial connections. Loyalist Elizabeth Johnson, for example, recounted in her letters that she was only able to afford the seafare due to the sale of slaves. Another option in the empire seemed much more attractive for refugees due to land that was being offered for new white settlers: Canada. The vast majority of former Loyalists indeed chose the Great White North as their new home. Most of Quebec was populated with a large French-speaking Catholic majority. The ironic legacy of the Quebec Act, which had helped instigate the events of the Revolution down south, meant that French speakers and Catholics had some degree of freedom, a fact which did not altogether please the new Protestant minority. Loyalists swelled the ranks of what was then called Quebec to the point that the province would be divided into two parts: Lower Canada, Quebec, and Upper Canada, Ontario. Similarly, largely due to the growth of the Loyalist population in Nova Scotia, a new colony called New Brunswick was created in 1784. Refugees to Canada generally integrated themselves quite well, but there were a great many challenges in regards to land and housing. A theme that would repeat itself for many Loyalists was that the promises of the British Empire were often less ideal than the implementation. In reality, the Empire often failed to obtain sufficient restitution for stolen goods or property seized by patriots, and many families started from scratch upon arriving in Canada. An editorial written by a pseudonymous Americanus in the St. John Gazette provides some insight into the feelings of recently arrived Loyalists to Canada. "I have been all my life a Loyalist. We scarcely dare view tomorrow. Our provisions almost gone. Our lands not brought into cultivation. Our loyalty suspected. My distressed countrymen, be firm in the protection of the birthright handed down to you, and supported by our happy Constitution. Upon no account lose sight of what you are, In fine, let the world know, as you know, the rights you are jealous of as descendants of Britons. While Americanus's identity was never revealed, the St. John Gazette was shut down for merely publishing this. Lieutenant Governor Carleton of New Brunswick remarked, "I think on all accounts it will be best that the American spirit of innovation should not be nursed among the loyal refugees." And in the early years of Loyalist settlement, this certainly seemed to be the case. In 1785, the governor called an election in an attempt to calm the frustrations of the recent arrivals. This election, however, pitted two opposing forces, the merchants, tradesmen, and common workers, called the Lower Cove, against the authoritarian rich elite, the Upper Cove. These tensions between the landed elite, some of them more well-to-do refugees than other recent arrivals, reached a boiling point at a riot at Mallard House Tavern, where the Lower Cove lashed out and attacked members of the opposing party. The riot was quelled by force, and when the election did not return the desired result, the governor simply disqualified 200 votes to ensure the incumbents won. The new refugees to Canada were not the only group unsatisfied with the Empire's payment for loyalty. A general attitude among the northern Indian tribes that had fought for the British was that the Empire desperately needed to accommodate the Five Nations for their service to the king. One man in particular, Joseph Brant, a half-Mohawk, half-English leader, was instrumental in obtaining land in Canada for the Mohawks. Brant traveled to England to ask for restoration for the property and land stolen from the Mohawks, which eventually resulted in the Six Nations Reservation, still there today. Eventually, the initial political shockwaves from the arrival of the Loyalists to Canada would settle, and Loyalists would enter into the mainstream of Canadian life. Slowly but surely, the Loyalists would win themselves political representation in all provinces, with a much lower functional tax rate than the mainland United States. Canadians began to pride themselves on having achieved everything desired by the American Revolution, but without the bloodshed. A country equal to Britain in representation, but loyal to the crown. But Canada was not the only option. Southern colonists, unaccustomed to the cold climate of the North and desiring to continue their plantation lifestyles, settled on eastern Florida as their destination of choice. East Florida made sense from a climate standpoint, although there was some question about its viability for farming. For many Loyalists, having already moved multiple times throughout the course of the war, the hope was to make East Florida their final home. Until one dark day when the news of the Treaty of Paris came to Florida. In April 1783, East Florida Loyalists were blindsided by the Paris Peace Treaty. It was bad enough that the treaty dashed hopes of getting any money back from the United States. What really stung was Britain's decision to give Florida to Spain. British negotiators thought this was a fair trade-off for holding on to Gibraltar, a key strategic asset, but it left the Loyalists high and dry. Unless they were willing to pledge loyalty to Spain and convert to Catholicism, they had 18 months to pack up and leave, feeling betrayed by their own government. Loyalist Elizabeth Johnston said that the treaty had caused more pain to the Loyalists than the war ever did. Another Georgia-turned-Florida Loyalist remarked, "It was the severest shock our feelings have ever had to struggle with. Deserted as we are by our king, banished by our country, what recourse is left us in this combination of calamities? Heavens, what distress, that men who not only possess the necessaries, but all the luxuries of life, should become vagrant and be plunged in the torrent of misery and despair by the Parliament of Britain, who, having no further occasion for their services, treat them with contempt and mock their sorrows. We are all cast off. I shall ever though remember with satisfaction that it was not I deserted my king, but my king that deserted me." Many knew that the next step would naturally be some other British territory. Others still headed further west, into almost totally unknown territory, deciding they could no longer trust or desire the protection of the British Empire. We know little of what happened to those people. The Bahamas, unlike Jamaica, had not traditionally been regarded as useful for anything other than salvaging and fishing. Desperate for options, however, many East Florida Loyalists chose the Bahamas as their final stop. The locals began to fear that resources and provisions could not continue to supply the staggering amount of refugees to the small island. At one point, a riot broke out among the refugees over their poor treatment. In 1782, Spain seized control of the Bahamas, causing unease among Loyalist refugees in nearby East Florida who were wary of the Spanish military presence. This kicked off one of the very last conflicts of the Revolutionary War, albeit outside the U.S. mainland. A South Carolina Loyalist named Andrew Devoe, dissatisfied with waiting for aid from the British and fearing the worst, took initiative. Convinced that any favorable outcomes would be the result of their own efforts rather than British intervention, Devoe started recruiting volunteers for an expedition to reclaim the Bahamas. To give the impression that his fleet was much larger than it really was, Devoe had his men disembark from the ship, come ashore, and then repeat. This trick was so effective that Spanish troops evacuated the fort without engaging in battle. On April 18, 1783, Devoe hoisted the British flag over Nassau. Unfortunately for Devoe, the battle had no real purpose. The conflict in North America had already formally concluded a month prior, and the peace treaty written had secured the return of the Bahamas to British rule. Essentially, the Bahamas would have been shortly in British hands anyway. Other Loyalists chose Jamaica, which was often feared due to the tropical climate, disease, and large enslaved population. The threat of a slave revolt loomed large in the minds of the white population. Elizabeth Johnston had a child die of yellow fever in Jamaica, and many other refugees suffered the same fate. Inconsolable, Johnston would eventually flee for her final destination, Canada. So that's it for the Americas. But where else did Loyalists find themselves? We've all heard the tale of Benedict Arnold, the hero of Saratoga who betrayed the Patriots and defected to the British. But most do not know that his sons went off to serve in the East India Company, both later marrying Indian women. Cornwallis, for his part, also died in India, having restored his reputation by serving faithfully in his post as governor. Another curious tale concerns William Linnaeus Gardner, an American-born Loyalist who took integration into Indian society to another level. Alida Livingston, Gardner's mother, originated from one of New York's most esteemed landed families. His own lifestyle and governance were so reminiscent of European nobility that he informally bore the title of Lord. Later that same year, the family attempted to sail to Britain, but were intercepted and remained in the U.S. until New York was evacuated. Upon the war's conclusion, the Gardners joined the Loyalist migration out of America. Facilitated by Lord Cornwallis's influence, Gardner was assigned to a regiment in India in 1790. In 1798 in Surat, his life underwent a significant transformation. While participating in tedious diplomatic discussions, Gardner caught sight of the local Nawab's daughter and proposed to her instantly. The idea of returning to the West was discarded. Gardner became increasingly entrenched in Indian life, remarking once that India was, quote, a country far preferable to the cold climate and still colder hearts of Europe. He relinquished his British commission to serve the Maratha chieftain, becoming one of several white officers in native armies. Post-Maratha defeat, he founded a cavalry unit for the East India Company known as Gardner's Horse. He led this unit into Nepal and also participated in British military operations in Burma in 1825. In between campaigns, he returned to his family estate by the Ganges, where he embraced a lifestyle far removed from his Western origins. His favored granddaughter was named the Morning Star in Hindustani, but her English name, Alida, a legacy from William's mother, and a frequent name in the Livingston family, served as a poignant reminder of his New York lineage. To this day, the 2nd Lancers remains one of the most decorated regiments of the Indian Army. It's easy to think of these Loyalists as the losers of the Revolutionary War, displaced, reduced to refugees by the end of the war, and forced to evacuate their homes. The British loss at Yorktown signified Britain's greatest military defeat until the Second World War. But the following 10 years would, ironically, see the British Empire reach one of its greatest heights, conquering new territories, dominant in world affairs. By the British victory in 1815 at Waterloo, the British were completely ascendant in Europe and would begin to assert their dominance in Asia. The Loyalists who would arrive in Canada, destitute and penniless, would eventually change the country forever, obtaining the same rights and privileges as their brothers south of the border. No doubt many patriots suffered horribly before, during, and after the Revolutionary War, and no side in any conflict is blameless. But the patriots' stories have been described in great detail in standard American histories. The Loyalists deserve to have their story told as well.